There is a silent force that operates in the shadows of the human mind, corroding self-esteem, distorting the perception of personal value, and determining, with brutal precision, the invisible limits of what someone believes is worthy of living, expressing, or feeling. This force does not impose itself with physical violence, but with an overwhelming psychological subtlety. Its name is shame. Few emotions are as misunderstood, and at the same time so deeply rooted, as shame. It is the emotional parasite that feeds on silence, secrecy, and self-accusation. While guilt refers to a specific behavior, I did something wrong, shame goes further. It infiltrates identity, making the individual believe that I am something wrong. And it is in this seemingly subtle detail that its destructive power resides. From the earliest years of life, shame begins to form in an almost imperceptible way. It hides in the disapproving gaze of an adult, in the cruel comparisons between siblings, in the subtle criticisms about the body, the way, the personality. The child, still without the resources to question these messages, internalizes the idea that there is something wrong with them, not with what they did, but with who they are. And thus, the process of internal fragmentation begins. To be accepted, they need to hide parts of themselves. To be loved, they must adapt to external expectations. Authenticity is sacrificed on the altar of approval. Over time, these messages become a constant internal voice, an invisible judge that scrutinizes every step, every thought, every natural impulse with suspicion. That is why so many adults live trapped within themselves, policing desires, suffocating emotions, avoiding any trace of vulnerability. Because they have been conditioned to believe that showing who they really are would make them unworthy of love, respect, or belonging. Shame then becomes a system of control, a psychological mechanism that prevents the individual from living freely. They adapt, mold themselves, hide, not because they want to, but because they feel they need to. And the longer this structure operates without being challenged, the more it becomes confused with the very identity. The person stops realizing they are ashamed and begins to believe they are in fact inferior, inadequate, defective. This video exists to break that cycle, to reveal the hidden gears of shame and show that it is not an absolute truth about who you are, but rather a learned system imposed and maintained by the fear of social judgment. Understanding how shame forms, how it acts, and most importantly, how to deactivate it, is one of the most liberating steps someone can take. And that is exactly what you're going to discover now. To understand the destructive power of shame, it is essential to differentiate it from an emotion with which it is often confused: guilt. Although both are linked to feelings of inadequacy or wrongdoing, they operate on radically distinct levels of the human psyche and carry very different consequences for an individual's emotional development. Guilt is a healthy emotional response when aligned with moral awareness. It alerts us that we have done something that violated our own values or harmed another person. When genuinely felt, guilt can lead to repair, learning, and growth. It is like an emotional traffic signal. It indicates that something needs to be corrected, but it does not compromise the essence of who we are. The message of guilt is, you did something wrong, fix it. Shame, on the other hand, transcends the boundary of behavior and directly impacts identity. It does not say that you did something bad. It asserts that you are bad. This seemingly subtle difference carries devastating implications, because while guilt preserves a sense of dignity, shame destroys it. It silently corrodes self-esteem, poisons self-perception, and turns every mistake, every rejection, every imperfection into evidence of existential inadequacy. People dominated by shame do not say, "I made a mistake." They say, "I am a mistake." And when this feeling becomes chronic, it not only limits the authentic expression of the person, but forms the basis of a toxic identity. It is from there that destructive behavior patterns, such as extreme perfectionism, paralyzing procrastination, the compulsive need to please, and even self-destructive behaviors, take root, all trying to compensate for or hide what the person believes to be a fundamental flaw within themselves. Shame is silent, but relentless. Unlike guilt, which can be rationally processed, shame seeps into the body, into emotional memory, into unconscious gestures. It manifests in downcast eyes, in body rigidity, in difficulty exposing oneself, in accepting oneself, in loving oneself. And the most dangerous part, it camouflages itself. Often we do not realize that we are operating from shame because it has already become part of our way of being. But where, after all, does this shame begin? How does something so corrosive settle in so early and so deeply in the human mind? In the next section, we will investigate the origins of shame and discover how, from childhood, we are trained to believe that there is something wrong with simply being who we are. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Shame does not arise with the human being. It is constructed, conditioned, and transmitted. No child comes into the world believing that there is something wrong with themselves. On the contrary, the natural state of the human being is authenticity, expressing desires, emotions, and impulses without fear, without censorship. However, this pure and spontaneous state begins to be repressed very early, usually by those who should protect and nurture that authenticity: parents, caregivers, teachers, and society as a whole. It all starts with small gestures that seem harmless. A disapproving look when the child cries, a subtle comparison between siblings, an impatient comment in response to a question or curiosity, an exaggerated punishment for something that was merely an attempt to explore the world. It is in these moments that the child begins to internalize a dangerous message. If I am myself, I will be punished. If I express what I feel, I will be rejected. If I show who I am, I will not be loved. This process of internalization is deeply traumatic, even if it occurs without shouting or explicit aggression. The child, out of a need for belonging and survival, learns to shape their behavior to fit the expectations of adults. They begin to repress emotions considered ugly: anger, sadness, frustration. They learn that showing vulnerability is weakness, that being spontaneous is inappropriate. And thus, the first psychic division arises. The true self is locked away, and a mask is created in its place. This mask is the false self, an identity construction shaped not by what the person is, but by what they believe they need to be to receive acceptance. John Bradshaw, in his seminal work, Healing the Shame That Binds You, describes this false self as a form of psychic survival. The individual alienates themselves from their essence to avoid the pain of being rejected. But this alienation comes at a high price. It generates an internal void, a constant feeling of inadequacy, and an insatiable quest for external validation. Over time, this dynamic becomes automatic. The adult who was once a child learns to censor their own thoughts and emotions even before expressing them. They do not even realize they are hiding because they have already forgotten who they were before adapting. And worse still, they begin to judge and reject others with the same rigor with which they were judged. Internalized shame not only traps us, it becomes a pattern that we unconsciously perpetuate in relationships, in parenting, in professional life. It is a self-reinforcing cycle. And to break it, we need to understand how this shame, once implanted, transforms into an internal system of surveillance, a psychological mechanism that prevents us from living with freedom and truth. In the next section, We will explore how shame begins to control every gesture, every thought, every choice, as if we were being watched all the time by an invisible judge who never sleeps. Once installed, shame ceases to be just a reactive emotion and transforms into a true system of psychic surveillance. It becomes a constant presence, an invisible judge that accompanies every thought, every gesture, every impulse. And, the most perverse part, this judge is not outside. It lives within you. This internal surveillance is so subtle and automated that most people don't even realize they are being observed by themselves. It's that internal voice that says, "Don't talk too much. Don't show that. That's ridiculous. No one will take you seriously." It's the discomfort that arises when you express yourself authentically and then feel a wave of embarrassment, as if you've committed a crime for being true. It's the constant self-censorship, the need for approval, the irrational fear of not being accepted. This internal judge, shaped by childhood experiences and reinforced throughout life, settles in as a permanent punitive instance. It does not guide, it condemns, it does not correct wisely, it humiliates. And the more internalized it is, the more the individual confuses this voice with their own conscience. But it is not conscience. It is conditioning. It is not prudence. It is fear disguised as reason. This system of surveillance acts like a prison without walls. It prevents the subject from experiencing the freedom of being who they are. Desires are repressed. Ideas are filtered. Spontaneity is sacrificed. The person lives in self-monitoring, anticipating judgments, avoiding situations that might expose them to the gaze of others. But the real problem is not the gaze of others. It is the introjected gaze, which is constantly triggering the alarm of shame. Michel Foucault, in his analysis of the mechanisms of power and social control, describes how the vigilant gaze becomes more effective when it is internalized by the individual. Power, then, no longer needs to be exercised from the outside in. It is automated, naturalized, internalized. Shame works exactly this way. It is the psychological mechanism that ensures conformity without the need for external coercion. And what is the result of this? A life driven by fear. Fear of failure, fear of being seen, fear of not being enough. Shame empties the individual of courage, creativity, authenticity. It transforms them into a reduced version of themselves, an acceptable, palatable, domesticated version. But if shame operates in such a silent and effective way, how can we identify it? How can we perceive when we are under its control? In the next section, we will learn to recognize the triggers of shame, the voices that sabotage us, and the thought patterns that keep this internal judge active, so that we can begin the process of deactivating this system. Shame rarely presents itself in an obvious way. It doesn't knock on the door announcing its arrival. It disguises itself. It adopts soft tones, internal phrases that sound reasonable, automatic gestures that seem natural. Therefore, identifying it is a meticulous work of self-awareness. It is also one of the most challenging steps in the journey of liberation. To begin with, it is essential to understand that shame lives in language. Pay attention to the words you repeat to yourself in moments of difficulty. Phrases like, "I am a failure," "No one will accept me this way," "I am not good enough," "I always mess everything up." All these expressions reveal the presence of shame. They are not just describing a situation. They are making an ontological statement about who you are. This is the heart of shame. It does not attack behavior. It attacks being. Another clear indication is patterns of avoidance. Shame manifests when you flee from situations where you could be seen more deeply. You avoid public speaking, expressing opinions, taking creative risks, expressing desires, setting boundaries. Not because of a lack of ability, but because there is a paralyzing fear that by showing yourself, you will be unmasked as someone unworthy. Shame thrives on the fear of exposure. Furthermore, it manifests in self-sabotaging behaviors. Chronic procrastination, addictions, compulsions, social isolation, perfectionism. All these patterns have deep roots in shame. They are unconscious strategies to avoid the pain of judgment, the pain of rejection, the pain of not being enough. Often the individual doesn't even realize they are sabotaging themselves. They just feel a weight, a fatigue, an internal voice saying that it's not worth trying. There is also a tendency to project shame onto others. People dominated by internal shame often become critical, judgmental, or overly demanding of others. This happens because, by attacking outside, they try to numb the pain they feel inside. It's as if they are unconsciously saying, "If I can't accept myself, no one else deserves to be accepted as they are." Recognizing these signs is painful. It requires courage, patience, and profound honesty with oneself. But it is also liberating. Because from the moment you identify the voice of shame, you begin to separate what is you from what is conditioning. You start to realize that this internal judge is not your truth. It is an echo of the past. And then the inevitable question arises, what to do with this? Now that you recognize the enemy, how do you deactivate it? How do you silence those internal voices that sabotage your freedom? The answer lies in self-compassion, but not that superficial version that trivializes suffering. I'm talking about an active, deep, and courageous compassion. In the next section, you will understand how to cultivate this transformative strength and finally begin to break the cycle of shame. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Shame takes deep roots when a person believes they need to earn love, acceptance, and respect. When they start to condition their own worth to performance, appearance, or an idealized behavior that can never be fully sustained. Breaking this cycle requires much more than willpower. It requires the courage to confront one's own wounds, and above all, it requires self-compassion. Self-compassion, contrary to what many think, is not treating oneself with blind indulgence. It is not pretending that nothing hurts. It is not repeating empty mantras in the mirror, trying to force self-esteem. True self-compassion is a revolutionary act. It is recognizing one's own pain with clarity and still remaining present. It is looking at the most vulnerable parts of oneself without contempt, without judgment, without escape. It is creating an internal space where you can exist wholly, even with flaws, imperfections, scars. Kristin Neff, one of the leading authorities on self-compassion, states that this practice is not a weakness, but a powerful form of emotional self-regulation. When you practice self-compassion, your nervous system begins to come out of a constant state of alert. You exit the threat mode, activated by shame, and enter safety mode. And it is in this state that true growth occurs. But to get there, one must go through a crucial phase, confronting the internal voice of shame. This voice, which for years has been considered an unquestionable truth, needs to be challenged. You start to ask, who taught me to see myself this way? Where did this belief that I am inadequate come from? What makes me believe that my worth depends on others' approval? These questions are not rhetorical. They are instruments of dismantling. Because as you answer honestly, you realize that the shame you carry was not born with you. It was learned. And everything that has been learned can be reconfigured. This is the turning point. The realization that you are not the problem. You have a problem, shame, but that does not define who you are. Practicing self-compassion also means allowing yourself to make mistakes without self-destruction. It is understanding that failure is part of the human experience and that there is no authentic path without stumbling. It is starting to treat yourself as you would treat a wounded child, firmly but gently, with responsibility but also with love. And gradually, the cycle begins to break. Shame, once absolute, starts to lose its power. It does not disappear immediately, but it loses its monopoly over your identity. And that is freedom. But the journey does not end here, because shame, as we said, survives in the dark. To truly weaken it, it must be exposed. In the final section, we will explore how bringing shame to the light of consciousness radically transforms its presence and reveals a new path, one of living with authenticity, courage, and truth. Shame is a psychological parasite that only survives in environments of darkness, silence, and secrecy. It feeds on what is not said, on what is hidden, on what you try to erase within yourself. But when you have the courage to look at it, to name it, to tell your story, even if just to yourself, something extraordinary happens. Shame loses its grip. Not because it disappears completely. It will still try to show up. It will still whisper old lies in moments of vulnerability. But now you know, that voice is not you. That pain does not define your worth. That prison is not eternal. Shame, once illuminated by awareness, begins to dissolve, because it was never a truth, just a construct. A lie repeated so many times that it seemed real. The key to living an authentic and courageous life is not in trying to become perfect, but in allowing yourself to be human, to err, to feel, to change your mind, to be vulnerable, to fail, and to continue loving yourself through it all. Shame tries to convince you that there is something in you that, if exposed, will make no one love you. The truth is exactly the opposite. It is when you expose yourself with truth that real love becomes possible, including self-love. At this moment, you may be carrying old weights, phrases you heard in childhood, looks that marked you, experiences that left scars. But now you have tools. Now you have language. Now you know where to look. And when you see clearly, you are no longer trapped. You no longer need to hide. You no longer need to mold yourself. You no longer need to apologize for existing. You are not your trauma. You are not your failure. You are not the distorted image that someone once projected onto you. You are a whole, worthy, capable being. And from now on, every step you take toward your truth will be a blow against that internal system that tried to keep you small. If this video touched something within you, comment below. I choose to live with truth. Your vulnerability can inspire others who are still in silence. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it. Spread this light. And don't forget, keep watching. The next video is important for your journey. You have already started this process. Don't stop now. Shame will not control you again. Never again.